What up? Is Horatio. Today I'm going to be doing a critique and paintover of this piece on the right, which was submitted to me by Kana, aka artiswheremyheartis on Tumblr. She asked for critique specifically on the blood rendering and placement, and then anything else that I thought could use improvement. So I'm gonna just go ahead and get started. This is my third time recording this first portion of the video, so probably better that I don't ramble on forever and ever. So let me hide the paint over and this text. So the first thing that I want to point out is that the blood coming from the nose looks really good, actually. I don't think it needs a lot of work in terms of the shape. It's got a nice curve to it that matches, the planes of the face and the curves of the lips and the chin and everything. It's nice and convincing, and it gives you a sense of volume of, the form that's underneath it. Some of the minor issues that I see with it are with the rendering rather than the shape. So in certain areas like here and here and here, too, and here, the edges are a little bit fuzzy and blurry. Now sometimes you'll want the edge to be softer, not as hard-edged. That way you can indicate like smearing of blood. But in this case, these areas I don't think would have that kind of blurriness to them because the blood here is, pretty viscous and it's in the process of dripping and everything like that. So I would suggest just sharpening up the edges of these spots, and then that will, solve that issue. Another thing you'd want to pay close attention to is the drips in terms of their shape and, the width of the strings of blood as they drip. So you've got a couple here that could benefit from being tapered in gently. That way it enhances the the shape of the droplet of the blood, and it makes more sense in terms of gravity or whatever. And areas like here, you've got this kind of awkward straight angle, which doesn't really make sense for something that's dripping. So, like I said, just kind of let the transition be soft and smooth as you go down. And then I would also maybe make bring this down all the way so that it can warrant a droplet that's that big. Otherwise, it doesn't seem like it would be able to hang on. Even if it is about to break off the string, it feels a little bit awkward. And then just another little detail that would be good to focus on is keeping the shapes of the droplets nice and rounded. I mean, they don't have to be complete circles, but these, for example, are a little pointy. So it kind of takes away from the liquid quality that the blood has. But like I said, overall, the stuff coming from the nose is pretty good. Another little bit that I would suggest either adjusting or getting rid of would be these areas where you've got blood pooling. I think that the idea is good, and if the angle that the blood was coming out was different, I would say go for it. But in this case, because your character isn't tilting their head in any which way, the way that it's pulling underneath the nose doesn't really make a lot of sense because it would have to be going up, and there's no indication of it being smeared up. So I would just get rid of that section to make it more clear and more believable. And then the bit that's at the seam of the mouth is a little too even in width. And also it kind of combines with the corner of the mouth here being the same value and the same color, so it doesn't really read as being blood necessarily, except for maybe there. But you know, if you get further back out, it really just looks kind of like a thicker line being used for the seam of the lips. So I would either, you know, have it kind of connect some more with these areas, drip down more to warrant it being there. Otherwise, just get rid of it to make everything more clear and readable. The blood that I think needs the most work is the blood on the cheek here. It's got a lot of very pointy shapes to it. Doesn't feel as drippy. And it also, its placement feels a little arbitrary compared to the blood that's coming out of the nose. Because its position is so far from the origination of the blood, it makes you kind of wonder how it got there, and if there's no, you know, spray of blood or droplets or anything like that, or anything connecting it to imply that it was like smeared or something. It just seems a little odd compositionally, and it actually draws attention to a lot of this space that's, you know, pretty empty otherwise, in terms of like, you know, there's no features or anything on this, you know, part of the cheek, obviously. And also the just the shape is missing some variety, and you've got another situation with kind of a straight looking drip. So with this bit, you know, I would suggest, like I said, connecting it to the main source, or moving it closer, changing the shape up so that it's a little bit less pointy and a little more interesting looking. The last thing that I want to address with the blood is the rendering. It would benefit from some more minimal rendering in terms of like the number of values that you're using. So for example, here in this one, you've got a lot of really tiny wiggly shapes in a ton of different varieties of lightness and darkness. And what happens is when you zoom out, a lot of that stuff gets lost, and then because there's so much variation in it, it might not be conveying the volume that you want it to. So something that I think is important overall, and that can be applied to other areas of this piece as well, is to consolidate areas of value and lessen the number of them. That way they read more clearly, and it also means you don't have to spend as much time noodling around. And it also will kind of force you to have to follow the shading and stuff that you've already established before placing the blood on there, so that it feels like it's really part of the same piece. And the last thing about the blood, I would say, is that especially the blood coming from the nose, while minimizing the number of values would help. Another thing to make it look really good would be to enhance the contrast of those minimal values. So the highlights here aren't particularly striking in the areas where they would be, and there are shadow areas that could be darker, and that would help to give even more, the feeling of the blood kind of dripping over the form of the chin. And you can also use like a brighter red at the edges, and especially areas where it's smearing and it's thinner and not as viscous, to make it really look like the blood is fresh and like it's being spread thin, because it'll be brighter when it's not like just like huge globs of drips. So that's the blood, and in a second we're going to go over the rest of it with a structural analysis. Alrighty, so gonna pull up this layer where I've traced over your line work specifically, and nothing else. So highlights have been left alone, as well as the shadow shapes and everything like that. So this way we can first focus just on the overall effect that the lines are giving us. So I'm going to hide the original, make it a little bit easier to see. And I'm also going to pull up my corrections. So this is kind of my redrawing. So I'd like to start off by saying that you've got a really good handle, I think, of... Ooh, cannot see that color. There we go. Of, the shape of the chin. It's got a really good sense of dimensionality to it, as well as the lips and the way that they, connect into that jaw area, as well as the muscle that's right here. And the lips, also, you've given a lot of detail to, the specific shape of them, and I think that lends itself really well to the quality of the piece. So I think that taking that level of care and putting it into the rest of your piece will give you a really good result. So I'm going to just point out a couple of different things that will be discussed more in detail, I guess, during the Paintover portion, but just stuff that could use improvement or changing. So the first thing that really sticks out to me is actually this turtleneck collar. It's very smushy, and this wrinkle in the center doesn't feel like it needs to be there or like it's in the correct spot. I would suggest to make it read better, and also to have more of a streamlined look and put all the emphasis back onto the face, would be just to shape it in a much smoother way, like I've got here, but while also considering like the thickness of the fabric and how it would hang. The next thing would be the width of the neck. I don't think it's super far off, but I think that when you start to make other changes with the face, you'll find that the neck is a little too thick, so you'll want to bring it in just a bit. Maybe more, depends, you know, your mileage may vary. I tend to draw kind of thin necks, so that's just me, but also kind of the shape of it, the way that it connects to the base of the skull, you can have it come in a little bit more. The jaw as well is another area, so kind of a good rule of thumb to go by is to take you know, the corner of the mouth and kind of pull down, and that's going to be where that end of the jaw is. And you'll start to see how once you do that, the neck clearly is too thick, and so you can, you know, adjust accordingly. And from this also you can see that the ear is too small and too flat, but this will give you kind of a good guide on how to shape and size it more accurately, and it'll still be properly in line with the bottom of the nose and with the eyes. Speaking of eyes, I think that's probably one of the biggest areas that could use improvement. They look very flat on the face, even when they're shading. They just feel kind of stretched out, as opposed to, you know, the eyeballs really sitting in the orbit of the eyes. So I would suggest to size them down a little bit, and also to, instead of having the pupil be pushing out, rather than that, would have it kind of resting in the iris, like you can see here in my corrected version. And then also kind of consider how big the iris and pupil are in comparison to the size of the eye. I mean, maybe this is a trait specific to the character. If so, you know, that's kind of a whole nother thing that would have to be addressed kind of differently, I guess. But in this case, I'm gonna assume that they just have, you know, pretty normal human eyes. So size the eyes down, size the iris and pupil up, and move the pupil back into the iris like it's really sitting in there. And that'll give you a lot more depth to the eyes. Along with sizing down the eyes, I would actually size down the eyebrows, eyes, nose, and mouth all together. You'll see when I do the Paintover that I neglect to do that with the mouth and just size these down and then have to go back and fix the mouth later. But overall, the placement of the eyes and nose and mouth in, you know, relationship to each other is pretty solid, and I think that, you know, you'll want to maintain that as best you can. That way you can always come back to these center features and, you know, reference other stuff off of them, like how I was referencing this edge of the jaw with the corner of the mouth, or the end of the ear with, you know, where the bottom of the nose kind of is, or where the start of the ear is at the eye line. Having these points of reference will make making changes a lot easier, because usually problems regarding drawings tend to spawn from the center, because that's where, you know, you are referencing from, or at least most likely that's where most people tend to reference stuff from if they're referencing within the piece that they're drawing. So yeah, I would suggest sizing that down, and then that way everything else will kind of start to fall into place. It'll fix the issue that you have with the size of the forehead. There's not really enough of it. And then it'll also allow you to, you know, going in line with the adjusted placement of the jaw, will allow you to get a more accurate hairline. Because the one that you have right now is a little odd. I think I see what you were going for, but it actually would come in more like this, and then obviously if the eyebrows were sized down, then they'd be further over, so they're not touching the edge of the hairline. And then this will also push these, you know, softer bits of hair further out from the ear, to fix this sort of pinched section over here. The hair, overall, because the color that you use for it is pretty dark, you probably don't have to worry too much about the line work, but if you know, really wanted to, I would say, you know, vary the, you know, the areas where you have kind of a implication of strands or whatever, so have some that are closer together, some that are further apart. That'll give it a more natural look, as compared to just the like swirly twirlies. And I would nix these little bits here. They're super pointy compared to the softness that you've got for the rest of the hair, and they also are kind of making the funky hairline stand out, because they're like filling in that empty space that would have been filled in otherwise, if you adjusted the hairline. So I just get rid of those, but other than that, like in terms of like the silhouette of the hair, I think it's got a nice shape, it's got a satisfying fall to it, and the haircut is cool, and also in the in your rendering you've got a nice texture for this like shaved portion of the head. So I don't think that that area needs a ton of work. The only other thing, which will be more clear when you start to adjust like the features within the center of the piece, is just the shape of the skull, keeping it nice and rounded, and then having the forehead angle more, to get a more convincing shape. But anyway, so that's kind of the analysis of just the lines. Let's bring in light occlusion. So what I mean by light occlusion is the shadow shapes. And by shadow shapes, what I mean is the areas where light is absolutely not getting to that spot. So basically, when I was going through your original painting, I looked at the areas where you had sharp delineations between a shadow and an area of light, and interpreted that as, you know, where the light is being occluded. So overall it seems like the light source is pretty clearly from over here, or maybe the top. And for the most part, I think that the placement of the shadows is pretty accurate. I think that there would be a little bit more in this section of the eye, but that would probably come easier when you've got the eye more situated within the orbit of the skull. This bit kind of doesn't make any sense unless you're going for maybe an indication of the lower eyelid, in which I would suggest indicating later on in, you know, the more subtle aspects of the rendering process, rather than establishment of the you know, main shadow areas. The shadow on the nose could be pushed further back and further down and given a little bit more form to help with just giving the nose a more clear shape. The area with the mouth, I'd say, is pretty good and on the right track. The section here for underneath the nose, you might want to give some more implication of the existence of the philtrum. And so I have it, that wasn't a very good example there, but I have it kind of dipping down into it and then coming back out because light is pooling into this hollow of the philtrum there. This area on the side of the face for the cheekbone and the jaw, I was unsure as to whether you were considering it to be like a light occluded area or not. But based on the rendering of it, it doesn't seem like the character's face is particularly like hollow in this in the cheek area, or that they have particularly prominent cheekbones, because they, based on over the way they look over here, they don't seem to be like jutting out or anything. So for that area, I would suggest getting rid of this large shadow shape, limiting it to just like the underside of the jaw where the form is, you know, turning and where the light is stopping from reaching it. And this area will be another one that can be tackled, you know, with a softer touch when you're rendering form shadows as opposed to the pure shadow shapes. The shadow here underneath the chin and on the neck doesn't match up with what you've got on the turtleneck collar, so I would suggest just pulling it all down into, you know, one spot, like the head is, you know, projecting that shadow over all of it, like I've got here. Let's see, is there anything else? You had some shadow situation going on. Oh, my thing isn't drawing again. Okay. Well, anyway, you have a shadow situation going on right here that doesn't match up with this area where there's definitely light hitting it. So I would get rid of this shadow, and again, like with a lot of these other planes, the subtleties of the form of like the forehead and stuff can be addressed with, you know, some the softer shapes that still allow the light to get to them. So that's the shadows. The last thing that we're gonna talk about for this analysis portion is highlights. So I've indicated two different types of highlights. Kind of main highlights, well maybe not main highlights, more spread out highlights, and then specular highlights. So specular highlights are going to be the ones that are areas that are collecting or reflecting the most light. So you'll want to limit them to give them the most impact in your drawing, and also really consider their placement. Kind of a rule of thumb that I go by with specular highlights is either areas where the facial features are protruding the most, getting a lot of light, so like the tip of the nose, this area, the cheek, usually has something like that, and then obviously like a highlight on the eye. Areas where the form is projecting outward and is just about to make a, you know, kind of dramatic turn downwards into the shadow. So here on the lip is probably the best example of that, where you've got it, you know, jutting outward, lights coming from, you know, somewhere up there, hitting this edge, and then it immediately turns down into the shadow shape. So areas like that, and then you'll have some spots like here, this pocket in the eye, where, you know, the how do I describe this without it sounding gross? The skin is sinking in. It's basically like the light is pooling in this area, and is also being reflected, you know, off of the skin around it, which is acting as like a secondary light source. So it's all getting kind of, the highlight is getting amplified by being in this pocket that's surrounded by other areas of light. So spots like that, this area here too might have one kind of in this section of the nose, and then you'll have some scattered up here where you know, the hair is going to be reflecting lots of light because it's closest to the light source. But so on yours, you've got a lot of specular highlights. You've got them all the way down here, where realistically the light probably wouldn't be catching as intensely. Now you do have this one here, which is good, and this one on the nose, which is good. You've got kind of the right idea with the placement of the specular highlight here on the lip, but it's kind of missing that shadow shape underneath it that'll really make it stand out and have more impact. So I would say to try to lessen the amount of specular highlights. That way they, you know, when you put them somewhere, they really give a lot of pizzazz. As for the other highlights, they'd be in areas that are also protruding out, but maybe not as much. So like here on the forehead above the brow ridge, here where the light is going to be pooling in the iris, on the chin, And then that area you kind of want to be careful to make it not look greasy, unless you want your character to be greasy, in which case, hey, go for it. Gotta have that greasy representation. Again, some of the areas where you've got highlights, especially on the hair, seem a little bit arbitrary and a little too much. So I would just try to limit them to the areas where they would really be, you know, catching the light that's falling on them. And then you could also probably have one or two kind of in the ear where it's protruding out a little bit. But anyway, that's kind of what I've got to say about the structural stuff and the placement of things and everything. Now I guess I'm going to move on to the Paintover, and we'll narrate over bits of that that are important. Otherwise, I'd like to thank you, Kana. Thank you again for submitting your piece to me. That's really awesome of you, and I really appreciate it. And I think that you have got a lot of great potential, and I hope that this helps you and helps others, and that you guys enjoy it, and that my rambling is not awful and painful and suffering to listen to. So anyway, I'll shut up and move on to the Paintover portion, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye! Okie dokie, so we're gonna start the Paintover. What I'm doing right now is kind of shaping the sides of the head and the neck to get them to a width that matches the corrections that I made. But I am painting on top of the original piece so that you can see how those changes are being made to the actual thing that's being critiqued as opposed to my thing. So kind of going through and getting the jaw to be the right shape and the right size for when I scale down the features of the face. And starting to draw in the adjusted turtleneck collar. Making sure that the rendering is more of a precise shape to support the choice of rendering it minimally. That way it'll still read with the right amount of three-dimensionality, but without taking away from the focus on the face. I'm going in and fixing up the hairline, filling in that extra space that was there at the top before, and now I am selecting the features to size them down. I neglected to do that with the mouth, but I end up fixing that later, so it ends up being okay. I'm placing the ear, sizing down the jaw a little bit more, and starting to indicate some turning of the form where less light is getting to certain areas. Now I'm really starting to simplify everything to kind of sculpt out the face and the planes of the face based on the corrections that I made that are on the side. So that's kind of using that as my guide as I paint along to make sure that I'm not forgetting any details. Trying to put in some areas where the light's going to be hitting more, but doing so very subtly. That way the skin doesn't look like too glossy or greasy or something. And for those areas I'm using kind of more of a yellow version of that peachy skin tone. Starting to work on the orbit of the eye, pushing back the original drawing a bunch so that I can later redraw the eye. Jump back and forth a lot between different features, just no particular reason. Work on something till it frustrates me or until it starts looking good, or maybe I get distracted by another feature or start thinking about another feature and decide I want to work on it before I forget what the heck I was doing. Back to the nose a bunch of times. I shaped it sort of weird. Here I'm starting to put in the eye and the iris, the pupil. Working the eyebrow back in. Using some softer strokes for the end of the eyebrow. Working on the lower eyelid area. And adding light to that pocket by the eye. In the original piece, the sclera of the eye was kind of a yellowy color. I went with something that was more neutral, more like just a gray. I think it looks a little more natural and also helps make the color of the irises stand out, since they're kind of a nice warm brown, and that looks good next to the cooler gray. Add a bit of the shadow color next to the hairline. I think it makes the hairline blend in a little bit better. And also makes it feel like, you know, there's something sitting on top of the skin, casting a bit of shadow onto it. A lot of messing with the jaw. I wanted to be really careful to keep the integrity of it, because in Kana's original piece, the chin area was particularly nice, so I didn't want to lose that by getting too crazy with how I fixed the jaw. I'm starting to carve into the nose a little bit more. And going back to the eyes. Since this is being rendered like as kind of like partially painterly, but also still has some lines and stuff, something I like to do around like the edges is to have a darker color, usually the shadow color, just along the edges of things. So like I've got along the edge of the nose, that darker color to help imply the turning of the form. And this is something that you can do with cell shading also. That's a technique that I use pretty much all the time. I think it's got a nice effect. Because it, like I said before, it kind of implies the turn of form, but it also softens the transition from your color to your line. So even if the line art is, you know, crisp and hard and even black, that softened transition can really add a lot to imply a value change. And I'm starting to add light to this area of the head. I leave the texture that Kana did because it looked really nice. I just added the light on top, so some of it gets covered up a little bit, which kind of helps with the transition of the shading, but I tried to still keep it in there because it looked convincing, and, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I'm shaping the chin, trying to get it to still work with the original design that she had. I'm kind of going back into the hair to simplify it, so kind of marking out the main areas of light and light occlusion. And because I started doing this in a more painterly style, I don't spend too much time on the hair, since you can imply a lot with just the, you know, placement of highlights and shadows and stuff. And hair doesn't have, you know, the same structural integrity that you have to be concerned with when it comes to facial features. Also just makes it go a bit faster, because I know that when I do line art for hair, it's a pretty tedious process deciding where to put the lines indicating strands and where not to. Put some highlights in. Without getting too overboard with how many of them I put in there. Starting to indicate the areas of light and shadow on the ear. Doing this with just the shadow shape makes it go a little bit faster than trying to work around lines that I've put down. This way I can shape it first and then kind of throw some lines down on top. Obviously you can render a lot, a lot further, get rid of any lines that you have at all, or, keep it simple and, do cell shading, but based on Kana's original piece, I tried to do something that was a little bit in the middle, a little bit loose, the further from the center of the face that you got. Back to that stubborn nose shape again. It's getting there. I'm adjusting the brow so it sits more accurately on the brow ridge. Softening the edges of it so that it looks more like hair. And adding some of that shadow color around the edges of it like I did with the hairline. It's a really tiny detail, but I think it helps a lot. And now I'm addressing the mouth, which needed to be sized down. But in this case, it didn't need to be sized down so much that, like, I select it and size it down. I'm just kind of painting the shape back into it. and a bit of highlight where the seam of the lips starts to turn over into the that muscle that's right underneath the lower lip. And now I'm painting over the lips to simplify the amount of values on them. While still trying to keep generally the same color. It looked like they were supposed to have like lip gloss or lipstick on them, so I let them be, you know, kind of a nice corally color. Transition from the pigment of the top lip to the skin. And adding the shadow. Coming back in to reshape the chin a little bit more to match the resized mouth, and to kind of bring some angles back into it that might have been lost. I'm starting to hit some areas with highlights. Going in with a pretty strong hand to start, and then erasing away. I like to keep the shape of my highlights like squares and rectangles and triangles. I think it adds a neat kind of graphic touch to the rendering and makes them stand out a little more because they're not as soft as you know, the form shadows and stuff that are on the rest of the piece. Now I'm going back into the hair. And adding a little bit of a darker value just in the shadow shape areas, not into the form shadows. having that darker color under the nose is especially important, I think, for really making the volume of the nose look accurate. You get a lot of bounced light that affects the shadow underneath the nose, but you want to keep it subtle so that it's still all one shadow shape when you squint. Back to the nose for like the millionth time. Delineating some areas again. Keep them from turning too mushy. Another good trick with the edges of shadow shapes to really make them pop is to add sort of a coral tinted color right at the edge, like I did with the top edge of the shadow on the nose. Kind of gives a feeling for the you know, the blood underneath the skin that shows up a little bit, you know, as light passes through. And now I'm going to be working on the blood. Copying Kano's original. Just kind of get an idea of what she had. But then I kind of go off the rails with it after a while. But it's good to start with the original kind of as a reference. And this is a piece I did for a blood tutorial I'm gonna use to color pick from. Go for kind of a cloudier brush for the where the blood's staining the shirt, so that it's not too round brushy. A lot of time I actually like kind of the look of obvious round brush, but that's more if you know, the strokes are directional. With that staining, it's better if I use a brush that's more applicable for the texture I'm trying to get across. Starting to apply some smear. Areas where the blood is thinner. Trying to get a satisfying shape and composition of the blood as it relates to, you know, the other features of the face. Wanted it to kind of swoop in towards the mouth and then follow up the hair, and then that'll kind of go back down to the hair that's by the ear, and kind of just spiral you inwards that way so that you don't start looking outside of the focal point of the piece, which is, you know, the facial features.
So get with the flow, let's go. Yo. Move.
Try not to let the edges get too soft in the area with the drips. There are a couple parts that I let sort of gradate outwards. Tapering and shaping those kind of main drip areas. I have to be careful with the shapes of the blood that's around the corner of the mouth, because I don't want them to obscure the expression. It would be easy to make it start looking like the character's smirking or something. Which I don't want to do, since the expression is supposed to be, I don't know, kind of haughty, maybe? Haughty or suspicious? Something that definitely isn't, you know, a smug smirk. So that's another thing you want to keep in mind when you're adding, you know, something like blood or any sort of substance that's resting on top of the skin and the features. You know, you want to have a cool looking composition of it, but you also want to make sure that it's not taking away from the mood of the piece that you're trying to get across. So now I'm going back into the blood with the shadow color, keeping it primarily in the areas where I have the shadow shapes already on the skin, and then I start to add it to areas where it would be on the blood itself, where the blood is thicker. And to also give the impression of it being shiny. And when I start putting in the highlights next to some of those shadow areas, it'll start looking really cool. I'm using that bright red for the areas where the blood is thinner. And it really starts to make it look like blood, as opposed to just like a bunch of dark goop. As you can see, I'm staying pretty far out. That way I'm not rendering too many tiny little shapes in the blood, keeping it simple. I am coming in now with an even brighter red for some highlights. And so those areas are going to be a lot smaller, but still try to limit them and make them nice and clear and purposeful in their placement. And coming into the home stretch with this light pink for the areas of the specular highlights, and the light pink is gonna kind of demarcate the areas where I can add a tiny bit of white for the spots where I really want the highlight to pop. See me futzing around trying to sort everything out and put it in its place, but there you go, there's the finished Paintover.